Ladies, begin your sun salutations. Pluto in Scorpio generation. Love it. Hard. Please don't.
Hello. My name is Cali, and I like to tell stories. Moment one. In the heartbeats in rhythm, together, people sitting, anticipating theater, watching the same thing. To empathize, we learn together in the same moment, waiting for a moment of connection in which our stories, all stories, begin to merge. But then, if I don't see myself in the story, the reflection is incomplete. The story is then, as he is, central, just as she's a supporting role. To the side. Mighty sword slay the dragon, save the princess, fight the giant. She's out. Not in the picture, her voice. And his we hear. When is she even there? Ever since the beginning of time, people have been telling stories. It was a verbal tradition first, passed down from generation to generation, sharing family histories, legacies, myths. You can imagine it, a multi-generational family sitting around a fire in the evening, everyone a part of the storytelling, the elders teaching the younger ones the tradition, sharing stories that spoke to the hows and whys of the universe, putting things into context that would ultimately allow for understanding in a time before Google or Wikipedia, before ebooks or the printing press. Then it began to be written down. And while everyone, you can imagine everyone, male, female, young, old, all had been part of the sharing of the stories, once they began to be written down, a lot of these stories were lost. Probably because often only the men had the means by which to write, the education that enabled them to translate their myths and verbal histories to the page, and societies which upheld men's stories above others. So it was their stories that survived. The others had been lost. But what happens when only half of humanity is able to share their stories? We begin to see only the reflections of half our history, a skewed image of the whole picture, in which only half the story and half of humanity is represented. And if we only see a part of the whole picture, we're not seeing the whole story. Theater is all about telling stories, the sharing of them, the empathizing with them, the moments that get seared into our brain. And in the theater, the possibilities are endless. Each character brings a new perspective. Each character brings new information, without which we wouldn't have the whole story. And you can show the same moment in many different ways. You can layer it with light. And you can add sound. All of which enables you to build on a moment and fill out and complete the picture, which, even without a word being spoken, has the power to communicate an idea so clear and stunning it can stay with you long after everything else is forgotten, but that one moment. And with live theater, there is a power in the connection between the performers and the audience, unique to that art form. And as there is an understanding that comes from being present in the space while a story is being told, in full knowledge that that moment is ephemeral and fleeting and will never be performed or experienced in the same exact way again. It's live storytelling, bringing us back to our roots when we all sat around the fire thousands of years ago in a moment of connection. But what happens to that connection if we experience stories in which we have no context? If the way we understand the world isn't being reflected? How then are we able to connect to what's happening, to make meaning for ourselves and our world? Since the very beginning, stories, whether verbal or visual, spoken into the night, around the fire, or painted on the cave walls, have helped us make sense of our world, whether it was learning to anticipate the change of the seasons or the movement of the planets. Long before we could really understand what was going on, even then, it was essential that we saw ourselves represented in order to gain understanding and to recognize our roles in the larger story and the way in which we connect to all humanity. For too long, the canon of literature that we've been exposed to in our lit classes has been from the male perspective, particularly the white Anglo-Saxon male. And so the stories have reflected that perspective. Most often, it was the hero's journey that we were reading about, a hero who at one point, young, naive, and flawed, now having encountered countless dangers on his journey, is celebrated as the conquering hero. We've heard a lot of that story. We've studied, discussed, entertained that perspective for centuries. Occasionally, we'd have an Aphra Behn, or a Jane Austen, or a Mary Shelley, or Bronte's sister, and even then, it wasn't until centuries later that stories written by women of color would be added to the list. Zora Neale Hurston, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, Isabel Allende, Jhumpa Lahiri, Amy Tan. But these have been exceptions, as the vast majority of the stories that we've been encountering and engaging with have been stories written by mostly white men and have highlighted the stories of conquerors, of colonization, in pursuit of power, wealth, legacy. But what does that teach us of humanity, of each other, of how to treat each other and engage with each other? Isn't it time for us to start learning from and engaging with stories that teach us other aspects of the human experience? Of how to cultivate and mend brokenness and in ourselves and others, and how to build up and restore, instead of just learning how to destroy and demolish. Throughout the vast majority of stories that we've been exposed to in our classes or on screen, and yes, even in the theater, the stories have been written, produced, and directed by men. From a study conducted in 2019 by tech entertainment company Production Pro, 87% of Broadway directors were male. Only 24% of choreographers and 13% of writers identified as female. In fact, we only had one female director of a musical on Broadway that year, Rachel Chavkin, who won a Tony for her direction of Hadestown that year. Gender disparity runs rampant in industries across the board, and the theater industry is no different. But wait a second, what is going on? Aren't women known as the great communicators? Aren't they known for those soft skills like empathy, sensitivity, intuition, multitasking? All skills that we know will become more and more essential in the 21st century and have always been essential in the telling of a good story. And yet our stories are still not center stage. We have to fight harder and longer to move the spotlight onto our half of the story. Because if we're only getting one part, one perspective of the story, we're not getting all of it. We've heard lots about the conquering hero, but what about those he's conquered? How much more would we understand about ourselves and our world? How much more connected could we be if we'd heard those stories? Think about it. What if we'd heard a bit of the story from the perspective of someone who joined our hero on his quest, or watched him from the beach as his ship sailed for unknown lands? And it's not as if these stories haven't been written. They have been for centuries. It's just they haven't been made central. They haven't been given the same time and space and attention. In the play The Trojan Women, originally written in 415 BC, ancient Greek playwright Euripides tells the story of the women left behind after their husbands had been killed and their city sacked. But how many of us know that story? The story of Troy and the Trojan War, and even the years that followed with Odysseus and beyond, yes, most of us are at least somewhat familiar with those stories, the women left behind, and what they did to attempt to rebuild from the ashes left after the wars had burnt their city and their homes to the ground. We are generally not as aware of that part of the story. But this, too, we need. We need to hear and connect to and relate to what happens after the destruction in order to find a phoenix rising from the ashes, for those times in which we're looking for hope after the battle, after the loss, and post-pandemic. It's not that we need to leave out the journey or the quest or the battle, but we need balance. It's not just destruction, fight, kill, conquer, win. There's so much more to humanity. We need stories that push back against destruction towards restoration and growth and renewal. And it's not like no one has been wanting or needing these stories to be shared. In fact, in many cases, they've already been written. It's just we haven't been holding them up. We haven't been giving them space. Black female American novelist and playwright Alice Childress wrote her play, Trouble in Mind, which speaks to racism, identity, and ego in New York theater 66 years ago in 1955. But it wasn't until this October in 2021 that her play finally opened on Broadway. So how are we going to find our way back to connection and growth and hope if we're only getting the story from one perspective, from one side that has dominated center stage? We can start by making a conscious effort to make informed and intentional choices, whether it's selecting which shows to watch on Netflix or plunking down a rather hefty amount of cash to see a Broadway show. Know where you're investing your time and your money. Who wrote and directed the show you're planning to watch? Who produced it? Do they represent strong female voices, and are they committed to narrowing the gender gap? All it will require is just a minute or two of research, just a minute or two of a bit more consideration before choosing where we'll spend our time and our money and which voices we're choosing to listen to. One reason why the entertainment industry is so unlikely to invest in female directors, writers, or producers is because historically their projects don't make as much money as those written, produced, and directed by men. So they're not getting produced. But that's where we come in. We need to commit to giving our time and money to films and plays that were written and produced by women and others who value inclusion and are committed to telling stories that include a range of voices so we can start changing the landscape of what is being deemed lucrative. If money speaks, then we need to start communicating that we want those voices represented. We need those stories to be shared. And in your lit classes, you can also begin to make changes by simply looking over the texts that you're being assigned. Does the list reflect the diversity in your classroom? Or is it favoring one gender or one race? And if these texts do not reflect diverse voices, use this as a point of discussion. Question these choices and make suggestions for alternatives that are more inclusive and represent a range of perspectives and stories. Suggestions for alternatives are not hard to find. In just a quick search online, you can find a list of novels and play texts that represent a wide range of perspectives. Take the Kilroy's list, for example, at kilroys.org, which is where I usually begin my search for new plays. Each year, they put out a list of 30 to 40 top plays written by women, trans, and non-binary authors of a variety of races and ethnicities. And it is where I found some of the most current and engaging texts I have read and produced. There's so much more to the story, so many more lives and experiences that represent who we are. There's so much more to humanity. So we need all stories, all perspectives represented. It's kind of like throwing ingredients into a recipe. If you're missing essential ingredients, the cake's going to come out wrong. It's going to taste off. You'll have too much of one flavor and not enough of another to balance it out. Yet, if we've never known what it's supposed to taste like, we've never experienced it as it was intended to be because we've always left out the salt or the caramel or the coconut, we may not even be aware of what's been missing. But there's so much more. We want to experience the full intended flavor. We want the whole cake, the full story. So we need both sides. Whether it's on the page or the stage or the screen, we need all sides, all perspectives represented in order to see ourselves and our multifaceted humanity reflected in the stories we share and the stories we engage in. No longer should it be one-directional. We need to flip the script. There even she is, when we hear his and her voice in the picture, not out. She's the giant. Fight, princess, save the dragon to slay. Mighty sword to the side, a supporting role. She's just as central as he is. Then the story is complete. In the reflection is myself in the story. If I don't see, but then begin to merge all stories in which are stories of connection for a moment, waiting in the same moment. Together we learn to empathize, the same thing, watching theater, anticipating people sitting together. In rhythm beats the heart in one moment. Thank you.